It was nearly 8:30 in the evening, the kind of hour when the city's richest came alive. The restaurant glowed with soft amber light, reflections shimmering across wine glasses and polished marble. Daniel Cross balanced a tray on one hand as he weaved between tables, the scent of roasted garlic and sea bass trailing after him. His back ached, his shirt collar was tight, and every muscle in his body longed for rest. But rent was due next week, and Emma needed new batteries for her hearing aids. He forced a polite smile as he set down another plate. At the far end of the room, a woman in a silver suit sat with a posture that could cut glass. Victoria Lane, CEO of Lane Holdings, barely looked up from her phone. Her fingers moved quickly over the screen, the blue light flashing against her sharp gray eyes. Across from her sat an older woman, elegant and quiet, her hands moving in gentle bursts of sign language. Margaret Lane's motions were graceful, but there was frustration beneath them. She was trying to say something, but her daughter wasn't looking. Daniel noticed while refilling a nearby table's water. He hesitated, glancing around to see if anyone else would help. Then stepped closer. He signed softly to the older woman, asking if she needed anything. Margaret's face lit up with surprise, then relief. She signed back, asking about the sauce on her salmon. Daniel smiled and explained with his hands, telling her it was a citrus glaze with herbs and butter. The warmth of her gratitude was immediate, almost maternal. But Victoria finally looked up, and her expression froze. She set her phone down, slowly, her voice crisp as frost when she asked if everything was fine. Daniel nodded, apologizing for the interruption. Margaret signed again, her hands trembling slightly with emotion. Daniel's eyes darted between them. He knew he shouldn't translate. He could say something polite, something safe, but the truth sat heavy in his chest. After a deep breath, he said quietly that Margaret wondered if her daughter would even notice if she disappeared from the table. The sound in the room seemed to vanish. Forks paused, mid-air. The low hum of conversation died. Victoria's jaw tightened. For a second, the armor of power slipped, and pain flashed in her eyes before she covered it with anger. She told him coldly that their table didn't need further assistance. Daniel stepped back, murmuring an apology. When he turned away, he could feel her eyes on his back like a blade. She picked up her phone again, but this time her hands were slower, deliberate. At 9:10, she sent a message to her head of security, the waiter named Daniel Cross. Find everything on him. By the time Daniel clocked out that night, the city air outside felt thin and sharp. He walked toward the bus stop, his reflection flickering in the dark glass of the restaurant window. Inside, laughter resumed, soft and distant. He rubbed the back of his neck, uneasy without knowing why. He had only wanted to help. He had only told the truth. But somewhere, high, above, his pay grade, a powerful woman had already decided he was a problem. And in that glittering world of money and silence, problems didn't stay small for long. By the time Daniel reached his apartment in Brooklyn, it was close to 11:15. The hallway lights flickered with a tired hum, and the air smelled faintly of old paint and rain from an open window. He pushed open the door to the small two-room apartment and exhaled in quiet relief when he saw the soft glow of a lamp still on. Mrs. Keller, his 70-year-old neighbor, looked up from the couch where she had been dozing, her knitting in her lap. She smiled when she saw him. He thanked her, pressing a few folded bills from his pocket into her hand. She protested as she always did, but he insisted. When she left, the apartment fell into silence except for the steady rhythm of the city outside. Daniel walked into his daughter's room. Emma lay fast asleep, her tiny hand curled around a stuffed bear. The nightlight on her dresser painted the room in shades of amber. Her hearing aids rested neatly beside her pillow, their delicate shells glinting faintly. Daniel sat at the edge of her bed, his exhaustion melting away for a moment. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, his chest tightening with love so deep it almost hurt. He thought of how far they had come. Years ago. He had been a scholarship student in linguistics, fascinated by the science of language. He had dreamed of teaching, maybe even writing one day. Then Sarah got sick. He could still remember the first hospital bill, the long nights in the waiting room, the way her hands trembled when she told him not to give up. When she was gone, he had done what he promised. He kept going. He took whatever jobs he could find. Janitor, delivery driver, waiter, anything to keep Emma safe. At the small kitchen table, Daniel opened a worn box and took out a silver pendant shaped like a teardrop. Sarah's pendant. He set it on the table where the light caught it just enough to glimmer. It was the last piece of her he had, and he carried it as a reminder of what love really meant. He ran his thumb over it and whispered to himself that truth mattered, even when no one else was watching. He remembered how learning sign language for Emma had changed him. At first, it had been hard, but as his hands learned to speak, he began to see emotions in silence that words could never hold. It made him more patient, more aware of the quiet pain in others. Like the older woman at the restaurant, he wondered if her daughter ever really listened. He leaned back, closing his eyes. But the peace didn't last. The memory of Victoria Lane's cold stare returned like a shadow. Someone like her could ruin him without lifting a finger. He checked the lock twice before going to bed, far above the city, in a glass office that never slept. Victoria sat alone at her desk. The clock read 12:45. She opened a report glowing on her tablet. Daniel Cross. No record, no complaints, no debt beyond hospital bills. Then came the photos. Him signing with his daughter in the park. Her laughter caught midair, his eyes filled with joy. Victoria's hand paused on the screen. The image unsettled her. It was too real, too pure. Her mother's words from dinner echoed faintly in her mind. Maybe the silence in her life wasn't from others turning away. Maybe it was from her building walls too high for anyone to reach. She turned off the tablet, but couldn't shake the feeling that the real prisoner wasn't him. It was her. By 8:30 in the morning, the grocery store buzzed with the soft rhythm of another day, the hum of refrigerators mixed with the scrape of carts and the faint smell of detergent. Daniel was in aisle 4, stacking cans of soup, his mind still tangled in the memory of the restaurant. He replayed every word, every look. He wondered if Victoria Lane had already called his manager, if this job would be gone by the weekend. He didn't notice the hush that spread through the store until it was too quiet. The sounds of chatter faded, and when he looked up, she was there. Victoria Lane. Her dark gray suit looked almost metallic under the harsh fluorescent lights. The polished leather of her shoes made no sound on the dull linoleum. She looked like a vision cut out of another world, one that didn't belong among price stickers and discount signs. Daniel straightened, his hands still dusty from the shelf. His heart pounded. He thought she had come to finish what she started, maybe to make sure the man who embarrassed her mother would never work again. But when she spoke, her voice was calm. She said she was not there to fire him. She was there to apologize. The words didn't make sense at first. Then she explained. She had read the report. She knew everything. About his wife. About Emma. About what he had sacrificed. She said she was wrong about him and that she wanted to make things right. Her proposal was impossible to ignore. She wanted to hire him as her mother's interpreter and companion. She would pay more than he made in a year. Daniel stared at her, unable to speak. He said he didn't want her pity. She said it wasn't pity. It was business. Her mother's happiness was something no corporate deal could buy, and he had somehow given her that, even for a moment. The store around them seemed to fade as they stood in the middle of the aisle. Two people from opposite sides of life trying to find the right way to speak. Later that evening, the air in the apartment was warm and filled with the faint hum of traffic outside. Emma sat at the table, coloring. Her drawing showed her father at work with a big smile on his face. She looked up at him and signed, asking why he didn't have that job anymore. The question hit him harder than any argument could. She wanted to see him happy. She wanted to see him free. When she went to bed, he sat alone for a long time, the silver pendant glinting faintly beside the phone. At 9:45, he called Victoria. His voice was steady when he said he would take the job, but with two conditions. His hours had to stay flexible for Emma, and he would report only to Margaret, not to her. There was silence on the line. Then she answered with one word: acceptable. Daniel set the phone down, his pulse still racing. The world outside his window looked the same, but something inside him had shifted. For the first time in years, the future didn't look like a wall. It looked like a door. Daniel's first day began under a pale morning sky. By 8:15, he stood at the base of Lane Tower, staring up at its endless glass and steel. The building looked like a mirror for the clouds, cold and unreachable. Inside, everything gleamed. The marble floors, the polished chrome, the silent elevator that rose with no sound at all. Security greeted him with professional distance, then led him through a private corridor into the penthouse. When the doors opened, the air felt different, thinner somehow. It smelled faintly of orchids and disinfectant. The space was vast and perfect, but lifeless, more like an art gallery than a home. Margaret Lane sat near a wall of windows, sunlight pooling around her chair. A book rested on her lap, its pages half read. When she looked up and saw him, the transformation was instant. Her face lit up, her hands already moving in greeting. She signed that she was afraid he wouldn't come. He smiled and replied that he couldn't refuse an offer like hers. The tension that had followed him from Brooklyn eased just a little. They began to talk, their hands moving in smooth, familiar rhythm. She asked about his daughter, and his eyes softened as he showed her pictures on his phone. Emma, painting at the kitchen table. Emma, at the park. Margaret's smile grew tender. They spoke of movies they loved, the old ones with black and white charm, and shared small fragments of loss and memory. Daniel found himself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in weeks. When she signed that her daughter used to laugh like this before she lost her father, the room seemed to grow still. Maybe you can help her open a window again, Margaret added, her eyes shining. Daniel nodded, humbled by her faith. He realized then that he had not been hired to translate words. He had been hired to translate hearts. In another room, behind the glass of her office monitor, Victoria Lane watched in silence. Her mother's laughter drifted faintly through the speakers. Unfamiliar and haunting. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure whether what she felt was pride or something much lonelier. Tension had begun to coil inside Lane Enterprises like a quiet storm. The halls were still polished and the meetings still efficient, but something underneath had shifted. Ethan Cole noticed it before anyone else. He saw it in Victoria's softened tone, in the rare moments she smiled when Daniel's name came up, and in the way her mother seemed happier than she had in years. It infuriated him. He had built his position through charm and calculation, while Daniel Cross, a man from nowhere, had earned her trust simply by being decent. That kind of honesty made Ethan uneasy. It couldn't be real, he told himself. It had to be broken. One afternoon he stood outside the penthouse terrace, pretending to take a call while watching Daniel and Margaret laugh over coffee. Daniel's hands moved gracefully as he signed, his eyes bright, his smile easy. Margaret was glowing. Even the staff seemed lighter when he was around. Ethan's jaw tightened. Jealousy slowly turned into strategy. He called a contact from his private phone and gave a quiet order. Within hours, a hacker had cloned Daniel's access card. A week later, Ethan walked into Victoria's office carrying a velvet case. Inside lay the Aurora star, her late father's heirloom, worth more sentimentally than financially. He stared at it for a long time before locking it in his briefcase. The morning of the betrayal began like any other. At 10:30, Daniel escorted Margaret to her appointment, then returned to the penthouse to check on a maintenance issue. At 11:15, Ethan's hacker entered the building using Daniel's copied credentials. By 2:40, the housekeeper found the safe open and the necklace missing. Panic spread quickly through the upper floors. Security was called, footage reviewed, names whispered, and there it was. A clear image of Daniel entering the apartment when no one else was home. Ethan presented himself as the one who had connected the dots. He told Victoria he didn't want to believe it, but couldn't ignore the facts. He handed her a report filled with data logs and timestamps. Everything pointed to Daniel. The betrayal cut deeper because she had almost trusted him. She stared at the footage until her chest ached. When Daniel arrived later that afternoon, smiling as he carried paperwork for Margaret, she could barely look at him. In the confrontation, words felt heavier than glass. She told him the necklace was missing, and that the evidence led to him. He froze, disbelief spreading across his face. He tried to explain that he hadn't touched anything, that he would never steal. She stood by the window, her back straight, her hands shaking behind her. The distance between them grew unbearable. Daniel's voice cracked as he begged her to believe him. He reminded her that his daughter looked up to her mother, that he had no reason to hurt the people who had shown him kindness. But Victoria's defenses had rebuilt themselves brick by brick. She ordered him to leave. Margaret entered halfway through, reading the tension immediately. She began signing rapidly, furious and desperate, insisting that Daniel would never do such a thing. Her daughter didn't meet her eyes. She kept her voice cold and precise, saying it was better to be cautious than naive. 2 guards appeared at the door. Daniel's shoulders sagged as they escorted him out. Outside, the rain had started, steady and relentless. Emma waited for him in the lobby, clutching her little backpack. When she saw his face, she knew something was wrong. She asked with her hands what happened, and he couldn't answer. He only lifted her into his arms and stepped into the downpour. For the first time in years, tears came freely, mixing with the rain. His heart broke not from losing the job, but from losing the fragile trust he had built. That night, the penthouse felt colder than ever. Margaret sat alone before the security screens, replaying the footage again and again. Her eyes narrowed as she caught something small that no one else had noticed. A reflection in the glass case, the faint outline of a man who wasn't Daniel, and the timestamp, off by nearly 10 minutes. Her pulse quickened. She reached for her phone, then stopped. No, this she would handle herself. The truth was there, buried in silence, waiting for her to uncover it. The morning light in the penthouse was soft and golden, falling across the glass table where Margaret Lane sat with her laptop open. The footage of the theft played on loop, the reflection of the screen flickering in her glasses. Her eyes, trained by a lifetime of reading lips and body language, studied every frame with quiet precision, the rhythm of movement, the tilt of a shoulder, the way the figure's posture changed between seconds. Something was wrong. The timestamp didn't match the building's access log. And in one brief, almost invisible instant, the glass case reflected a face that was not Daniel's. The outline was broader, the stance too rigid. Margaret paused the video, her heart heavy with both dread and clarity. By 9:20, she was standing in Victoria's office, the city glowing behind her through the tall windows. Victoria looked up from her desk, already defensive. Her voice clipped as she asked what this was about. Margaret didn't answer with words. Her hands moved quickly, signing that her daughter needed to see the truth for herself. She turned the laptop around, replaying the footage. Then she pointed to the reflection. Victoria leaned forward, her jaw tightening. Margaret signed again, asking her to check the call records. Victoria frowned but picked up her phone, ordering Marcus to pull the data. The silence in the room grew heavy as they waited. When the report arrived, it was undeniable. The call that had brought Daniel to the penthouse came from a burner phone purchased by Ethan Cole. Victoria's breath caught. The walls of her composure began to crumble. She looked out at the skyline, her reflection trembling in the glass. Every decision she had made since the theft replayed in her mind like a cruel montage. The accusations, Daniel's face as he pleaded for her to believe him, her mother's fury. Guilt rose in her throat like smoke, bitter and suffocating. For the first time in years, she felt powerless in the truest sense. At 10:30, she called Ethan into her office under the pretense of discussing a promotion. He entered with his usual confidence, smirking as he adjusted his tie. The lights in the room were dim, the blinds half closed. She gestured for him to sit. On her desk sat a file, thick and neat, and beside it, a flash drive. She played the video without a word. Ethan's smirk faded. He tried to interrupt, to twist the story, to shift the blame. Victoria listened in silence, letting him sink under his own lies. When he ran out of excuses, she opened the file, revealing every transaction, every trace of his deceit. The air turned cold. He tried to threaten her, said she would regret this. She stood, calm and unflinching, and told him that real power isn't about control. It's about knowing when to say enough. Marcus stepped into the room at her signal. Ethan's protest echoed down the hall as he was escorted out. Victoria didn't move until the door closed. Her shoulders trembled. The mask she had worn for years cracked completely, leaving only a woman who had finally seen herself clearly. That evening, she drove alone through the city. The rain streaked her windshield, distorting the lights until everything looked like watercolor. She stopped outside a narrow apartment building in Brooklyn and sat for a long time, her hands gripping the steering wheel. At 7:45, she climbed the stairs and knocked. The door opened slowly. Daniel stood there, tired, pale, older somehow. He didn't speak. She told him everything. Her arrogance, her mistake, her shame. She said she wasn't there to ask for forgiveness, only to face what she had done. He listened without a word, his eyes unreadable. When she finished, the silence stretched between them, heavy, but not hostile. He said quietly that after the accusation, he had been afraid he would lose his daughter, not because of the police, but because she would see him as something he wasn't. His voice broke when he said he had taught Emma that honesty mattered, even when no one believed it. Victoria nodded, her eyes glistening. She turned to leave, but Daniel hesitated. Then, without speaking, he stepped aside and held the door open. It was not a grand gesture, but it carried the weight of forgiveness more powerful than words. Later, Margaret would tell this story to Emma in sign language, her hands gentle and deliberate. She would sign that silence can destroy when it hides the truth, but it can also heal when used to listen. And in that small apartment, with the sound of the rain easing into stillness. The healing began. The afternoon sun rested gently over the countryside, wrapping the small garden in gold. It was early June, warm enough for soft linen and open windows, the kind of day when even time seemed to slow down. White chairs stood in neat rows beneath a canopy of oak branches. The scent of roses and freshly cut grass filled the air. Daniel stood at the front, his hands steady, his heart anything but. His suit was simple, just a crisp shirt and a pale tie that Emma had picked out for him. He looked toward the path where Victoria Lane was walking, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. Her ivory dress brushed lightly against the grass as she moved. No longer the cold, untouchable woman from the city. She carried herself with quiet grace. Her eyes, once sharp and distant, now held something softer. When she reached him, her hand trembled slightly, but she smiled, and in that smile was everything she had learned the courage to love without control. Margaret Lane sat nearby, radiant in a pale blue gown, the Aurora Star necklace resting against her collarbone, catching the sunlight in 1,000 tiny reflections. The officiant's voice faded into the background as Emma appeared, scattering petals from a small wicker basket. She wore a yellow dress, her curls bouncing as she walked, her laughter rising above the soft hum of the guests. When she reached her father, she looked up and signed to both of them that she loved them. Daniel's throat tightened. He signed back slowly, his hand steady, telling her that love doesn't need sound to be heard. Victoria joined in the sign, her eyes glistening. For a moment, the three of them stood in perfect stillness, bound together by a language that had once represented silence, but now meant connection. After the ceremony, the garden came alive with warmth and laughter. The tables were covered with wildflowers and small plates of food. Music drifted softly through the air. Margaret sat under the shade of an old tree with Emma beside her. She taught the little girl a new sign forever, and Emma practiced it with concentration, her hands small but certain. Victoria watched them from across the lawn, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm. She whispered that she used to think success was control, that power came from keeping everything contained. Now she knew better. Success, she said, was finding connection, even when it meant letting go. Daniel smiled at her and told her that some of the best things in life can't be planned. As the sun dipped low, the light turned golden, painting everything in warmth. Daniel, Victoria, and Emma stood together at the edge of the garden, looking toward the horizon. The breeze carried the faint sound of music and laughter behind them. Margaret watched from her seat, her smile tender and knowing. The three of them looked like a family that had been waiting for each other all along. Later, as twilight settled, the narrator's reflection filled the silence. Love, when it is honest, can rebuild what pride once destroyed. Sometimes it begins in pain, sometimes in forgiveness, but always with listening. In the soft glow of evening, their story did not feel like an ending. It felt like the first quiet moment of something that would last.